Hi, I'm Susan Colley, and welcome to You're Not Alone, Surviving a Child's Disability. Depression is usually considered a diagnosis identified specifically for adults. We tend to forget that depression can also be a very serious matter for children and teens with or without disabilities. Joining us today are Susan Weinstein, Director of Programs for Families for Depression Awareness, and Molly Melsack, representing herself as a young adult with depression. Hi, how are you today?
Thanks so much for having us.
Oh, you're welcome. What are some of the major causes for the development of depression in children and teens?
Well, depression is very often a disorder that runs in families, so the family history is really important. If any relative has a mood disorder, either depression or bipolar disorder, that greatly increases the chances that a child will develop depression at some point in their life. Also, some of life's stressors can result in depression for young people, as it does for adults as well. And there are issues of brain chemistry, and certainly a big contributing factor for a lot of people is trauma.
Oh, yes. What are the symptoms of depression specifically for children or teens, and adults? I mean, if you could address all of them, that would be great.
Well, sure. I mean, a lot of them are very common across all of the age groups. One of the key markers is developing disinterest in the things that used to interest you. If, for example, your teen used to be involved in sports or would regularly go out with friends and then stops doing that, that's a real sign of something that is more than just feeling out of it or not feeling their best. Sleeping too much or too little.
Eating too much or too little.
Eating too much or too little, for sure. Some of the more serious ones are if the person is talking about or thinking a lot about suicide. That's the biggest red flag that you need to react to.
Right.
But those are some of the, there's of course the moodiness. Often we think of depression as just being about sadness and hopelessness. The hopelessness is pretty consistent, but sometimes depression manifests more as irritability, which people with adolescents
especially
can certainly relate to.
Teens and adolescents, because they just don't want to be bothered.
Right.
And sometimes too with teens and adolescents, they like to isolate. And sometimes people think that's just normal because teens and adolescents don't often want to be around their parents or adults.
Right.
But sometimes that can be more serious in that way too.
Just a little note about this. Why do children with learning disabilities have a higher risk for anxiety and depression?
Well, certainly anybody who is different in any way faces unique pressures in school, in society. And so for kids with learning disabilities, they may be having their own struggles in addition to the regular struggles that kids will have. So all of that added stress can lead to higher incidence of anxiety and depression.
What age do you think depression really manifests itself?
There's a big spread, but over half of all cases of depression materialize by age 14. So that means that kids very young, 8 years old, sometimes a little younger, but in those early teen years you see a lot of it.
Now what about children, though? Do they seem like a lot more clingy and fussy, or is that a sign also of depression?
Well, I'm not an expert on any kind of particularly child. We look a lot at adolescents and older. But I think that if there's any kind of behavior that's raising concerns and it persists, that it's definitely a good idea to get it checked out.
Okay.
So to consult with either the pediatrician or the nurse practitioner in the pediatrician's office,
Okay.
or if you have concerns beyond that, there's all sorts of mental health practitioners who can help, and there are people who specialize in developmental disabilities that can also figure those things out. And your schools would be a good resource as well. If these are
Right.
children who are of school age, certainly the professionals in the school will know sort of what's the range of typical behavior for kids, and would be able to help sort of parse out what behaviors are not really the regular, ordinary kinds of behaviors that you wouldn't have concerns about.
Right, right. Now you're saying that most children and teens and even adults, that depression is more genetic than anything else?
Well, we don't really know everything that we need to know. I mean, these studies about the brain are just fascinating to me, and
yeah.
also all the things about our body chemistry. But there is definitely a predictive factor that you're more likely if you have a close relative who has a mood disorder. And if, as we see with bipolar disorder, there's a very strong connection in previous generations.
Right. So how does a parent recognize that their child's gloom and unhappiness is really a sign of major depression?
Well, it has a lot to do with persistence. If your child is behaving or your teen is behaving differently than usual and not functioning well, and it's persisting for 10 days or 2 weeks, it's time to get it checked. It's time to check in with the school, see if they have any ideas of what's going on. It's time to check in with a medical professional.
You want to say anything about that?
I would just definitely agree.
The other key signs in which you'd want to get it checked out sooner than 2 weeks
Right.
is if there are signs of suicide ideation, they're thinking about suicide, they're talking about suicide, they're gathering the means of doing any kind of suicide, those kinds of things. You want to act very quickly. And also, the other situation is if they're engaging in self-injury, if they're cutting or any of those other kinds of
Right.
behaviors. Those are kinds of things that you don't want to wait. You want to go get it checked out.
But it's still, I think, difficult to diagnose depression, especially in teens, because they're moody anyway.
Yes, they're always
Exactly.
things
You
are
know,
always
and
changing.
Things are changing, so it's especially if you're a parent that works and is not around your teen all the time, maybe they don't pick up the clues.
But I think what Molly was saying, about someone who's really isolating, that's a potentially big indicator of there being something wrong.
Yeah, and just seeing that your child or teenager is not engaging in the things that they might used to have been engaging in, or not hanging out with their friends, or if there's a real change in behavior. At first, it may not seem like anything because children and adolescents are changing all the time,
Right.
and new experiences are arising all the time. But I think what Susan was saying is the persistence and just checking in with your child and seeing how they respond to that. I mean, yeah, that's really what I would say about that.
And I was going to point out that the communication piece is really important, that you want to be able to talk with your kid and ask, are things going okay with you? I've noticed that you've been around more. What's going on with that? Being able to talk to your kid is sometimes hard, and especially when you're talking about things that are probably going to make your kid not feel so great.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of kids who are just feeling off enough that they might just say, things don't feel the same, or I'm not feeling great.
Yeah.
They might not have a name for it. They might not know this is depression.
Right.
But oftentimes with children, they might not bring something to you until you specifically bring it to their attention. They might not even really know how they're feeling. And so I think the communication thing is huge. It's, I wouldn't be where I am if my parents hadn't said to me, what's going on? How are you doing? Why aren't you doing this anymore? Why aren't you seeing these people anymore? I mean, that also prompts the child to think internally as well. Because so many things are changing, it can be confusing, and hormones and lifestyle changes, and there's so much going on. So.
Right. It's a hard age.
It really is.
Yes, I know.
How is childhood depression diagnosed? Do we go to professionals, or how about would you go about once you find out your child may be depressed?
Well, we have a tremendous shortage of mental health care professionals for children. In our area here in Eastern Massachusetts, we have well more than usual for the rest of the country.
Right.
But it's hard to get an appointment. So most people will start with their pediatricians. And the pediatricians are trained to do a screening and to see if there's some initial cause for concern. And they can refer someone to a therapist, they can refer someone to a psychiatrist, they can start the kids on low levels of antidepressants if that's called for. So the pediatrician is a really good place to start. The other thing you can do is to ask at your school about, do they have a psychologist that your kid can see?
Right.
Do they have a referral they can make? I mean, schools are often well equipped with social workers or school psychologists, or even some guidance counselors are trained in identifying potential depression. So it's something that is on many schools' radars. And so the teachers are learning, the school staff
Have they
is
been
on
taught,
board.
the teachers, more or less what signs to look for in their students?
You know, it depends on which school. However, Massachusetts enacted legislation a couple of years ago that requires 2 hours of suicide prevention training for all licensed school personnel every 5 years. So part of training about suicide prevention is being able to identify signs of mental health conditions, especially depression, because depression is the #1 factor behind suicide. And alarmingly, suicide is the #2 cause of death for people in the 15 to 24 age range.
Wow.
It's
That's
shocking
high.
and upsetting. It's it overcame homicide a few years ago, and it's well behind accidents, but it's very, very significant. So it is something that it's appropriate that it be in front of teachers, in front of school personnel, so that they can, you know, be part of that village that is taking care of our kids.
Right. So, Molly, when was the first time that you thought that something was going on, that you were saying to yourself, why am I so sad all the time?
So yeah, like as I was saying before, when you're younger, you might not necessarily have the word or the label to place on how you're feeling, and I didn't. It was probably around my sophomore year of high school. I was around 15. And I was really involved in my school. I had great grades. I had a lot of friends. I played sports. I did musicals. And then all of a sudden I started to lose my interest. And it wasn't anything in particular that prompted my change, but I started sleeping a lot, watching a lot of TV, either eating too much, not eating at all, fighting with my parents. And, you know, I didn't really have a reason, so I didn't tell anyone, because I said, why would I have a reason to be upset?
This is just normal. I must be going through some kind of phase.
Yeah, and you know, on paper and in my life was great, and there wasn't anything that I could have really identified as a problem. It wasn't until my parents started to figure out that something was up, and my school, I wasn't doing as much homework, my grades were starting to slip a bit, you know, I wasn't involved as much in sports, and it was more brought to my attention by other people. I didn't have a
Right.
label. I didn't have a way to identify what was going on. And other people said, "Wow, we're noticing a change in you."
Mhm.
And I felt, now when I look back, I feel really lucky that I had that.
That you
I
had
don't
the
think
support.
and I don't, unfortunately, think a lot of, not everyone has that. Not everyone has people that are paying attention all the time. But I did, and that's kind of how it prompted my.
Right.
You know,
And
and-
oh, go ahead.
And many people with depression and most people with bipolar disorder don't have the insight into their own condition and how they're feeling.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very hard for someone with depression to self-identify.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Now you said that your parents were basically the first ones that kind of.
Yeah, it was my
Found
parents and my school. So, I even when my grades were slipping, my grades were good, but my teachers could tell in class I was kind of
Somewhere
off.
else.
Yeah, I was somewhere else, and my parents noticed when I was home. I would be in my room, the door was shut. I was in my bed. Why, they're asking me why I'm sleeping so much. I was always telling them I was tired. There would be nights I didn't even want to have dinner, and then nights I would, eat way too much. And they just, at first, I think my parents must have thought, she's 15.
Right.
She doesn't want to have anything to do with us.
Right.
She's changing, things are changing. But then it was the persistence that we were talking about, where they were saying something's not right. She doesn't have that thirst for life that we once, saw in her.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until later that I really identified the reasons as to why this was going on for me. Because like I said, at first I just thought life is great. What would I have to be upset about? So
Right. But after you found out or that you had depression, what were the first steps that you did to rectify the situation?
So at first, to be honest, I didn't do anything. My mom wanted me, she first put me in therapy. I did have a guidance counselor at school as well that I would check in with when issues would arise or I was feeling anxious or sad, and I was really lucky to have that resource. I had great teachers and people that really cared about me. But at first, when my mom was putting me in therapy, I would cancel the appointments and say I don't need to go, and they wanted to put me on medication. I would say I don't need to be on medication. I would blame, things that my mom had done or my dad had done or people around me had done on what I was going through. And but the first step really was going to therapy, and that actually took a while. I mean, someone might start therapy and the therapist is not necessarily the right one for them, and that doesn't mean that therapy doesn't work. It just means that it's a process like anything else, and just finding the right person. And it took me a while to find the right person, but once I did, it really changed everything for me, to be honest. Because I think that the biggest thing about coming to terms with depression, I still have it. It doesn't go away. Almost 10 years later.
Right.
But I'm able to talk about it, and I'm able to reflect and look inside and think about my past and what's going on in order to make sense of who I am and why I feel these things. And so it doesn't affect me in the same way. It doesn't plague me in the same way because I have an awareness and an understanding.
Right.
And that, I think, has been the hugest thing. And having people in your corner to discuss with you, even as we're doing now. I mean, this, in its own way, it really helps. Communication, it's huge.
Communication is a big thing.
Huge, because you don't feel so alone. You realize that other people may have been feeling this way, other people may have gone through this, and you don't have to keep it all inside. And once you can let it go, it's very freeing, and it doesn't go away, but you're able to live with it, and you're able to function and find joy in life again.
Yeah.
And
Well, have you had any bouts of depression since that first one?
yeah, so I would say my first bout, to be honest, lasted from about 15 until I was almost 19. It was
Wow.
it was.
That's a long
It was.
time.
I was in 10th grade when it first really started, and I stopped going to school after my junior year. I took a year off, which also gave me a lot of anxiety with applying to college and stuff.
Right.
But I took a year off, and I spent some time really focusing on myself and what was going on. Really, for me, the biggest thing was identifying why am I feeling this way. And a lot of it, I'm adopted, and I grew up as a multiracial child in a primarily white environment. I had tons of friends, but I always, when I really look back on it, I always felt like I didn't belong in certain situations, and that wasn't because anyone did anything. It was just my own internal struggle with feeling like there was a part of me that I didn't understand and couldn't identify with. Also, my parents, because of my adoption, are a lot older than the majority of my friends' parents, and that was always a huge stressor for me. I was very nervous, and still am, about losing them before major milestones in my life, or before I feel like I'm fully ready to take care of myself. And I also went through puberty a lot earlier than most people in my grade, and I remember feeling really different and feeling like I was getting attention and not for the right reasons. And so I took that year off to really reflect on all of these things, and I found a therapist that was great for me. We found medication that was great for me, and then I actually moved. I grew up in New York City and then actually moved to Boston. I moved in with my aunt, and I finished high school here, which was really difficult to go from going to one school from kindergarten to your senior year and then starting over somewhere new. But at the same time, when I did that, I felt like I had this kind of newfound sense of self that I was able to go into the situation with, and so yeah, it was a long 3.5 years, but
process.
Yeah, but I say now to people, I can remember myself then, but I don't feel the same at all.
Right.
I have I have depression still, and I do get more so now, I would say, is anxiety. I get really worried about the future and the past and how things I'm doing are going to affect my life. But I have coping mechanisms now, and just ways to deal.
Speaking of coping mechanisms, what are the things that you do to help you cope?
Right. So I'm actually a musician.
Nice.
I went to college for songwriting in Boston, and actually my whole experience with depression has really motivated me to want to go and become a music therapist. And music has been a huge coping mechanism for me. When I'm not able to explain verbally even how I'm feeling, I can write it in lyrics or express it on my guitar or my piano. And too, with music, it's just such a unifying medium where I feel that when I'm sharing my music with others and people tell me, hey, I felt that way, or it's that connection that I was talking about when you're not feeling so alone. So music's been huge for me. I have really great people in my life, people who are aware of my depression and support me on a regular basis. I love walking. Working out is huge, really releasing that energy. But yeah, music, I would say, for me personally, is one of my biggest.
Music is great. A lot of people listen to music to try to get out of.
It's so universal.
Where they are, and
you can hear a song and you can immediately mentally go somewhere else, or it can make you feel something that you weren't feeling 5 minutes ago, and you're like, wow, you can hear a lyric and say, you just said what I was feeling, and I didn't even know how to verbalize that, and that's been huge for me. But also too, really having a support system and a network of people that are aware of what I go through and don't judge me for that. So that's big too.
We have found that there are 3 particular things that can really help people who are struggling with depression, and you can go with the acronym C. So getting adequate and regular sleep, eating appropriately, and getting exercise. And if you had to pick just one, which I wouldn't recommend. But the exercise is actually the thing that is shown to make a difference in dealing with depression. A lot of people turn to mindfulness and to meditation. Those have been shown to be very helpful, and certainly being with other people makes a very big difference.
What are some of the medications that they usually recommend for people who have depression?
I'm not an expert on medications, and in our office at Families for Depression Awareness, we really put our trust in the medical and mental health professionals to be making the decisions that are best. The things that we do talk about with medication is that they take a while to work. Very often you will not see results for 4 to 6 weeks, and it's really important to be monitoring what kinds of positive and not positive effects that a medication is having, and that's where the family members really have an important role. It's really important to not drink alcohol or to do non-prescribed drugs for that situation, because they can interfere with how the antidepressant is working. But there are a variety of medications that are available, and what we see is actually if you catch it early, then you don't even necessarily need medication. But even if you do, it can be a short course of a low dose, and it can be enough that it stabilizes the person so that they can get on back with their life again.
That's great. Now, just to back up a little bit, what happens if there isn't any insurance to pay for, psychotherapy, and what do parents do in that case? Can they get free services somewhere?
I mean, it's certainly more unusual than not in Massachusetts for someone to not have insurance, because we're ahead of the Affordable Care Act. But we know it exists. If you are someone who does not have insurance, I think it's worth checking in with your local Board of Health to see if they have any suggestions of where you might go. But we do have community health centers that do have mental health services. You can also find a therapist, and many of them will have a sliding scale available. There are ways to get care for everyone who needs it. The Department of Mental Health may have some resources available. The Department of Public Health can also have resources. It's very difficult
to find a psychotherapist, though.
Absolutely.
All of them are either busy, don't take any patients anymore, or don't accept. If you do have insurance, they don't accept the insurance. So I know the struggles.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually harder with finding a psychiatrist than a therapist, but both are hard. If you're looking for a therapist, I think your school would probably have resources available,
That's a great
have
idea.
Referrals available, and there may even be an organization that's affiliated with the school or provides psychological services for the school that would be covered for a short term. The other thing is, if someone is working, if the parent is working, they may have access to an employee assistance program, which might provide services, short-term services for their kids as well.
Great. Now, the last question I'm going to ask is, beyond the treatment suggested by professionals, what type of self-care that we've talked about can be utilized to fight depression?
Well, there we go back to the C acronym that we're really talking about. The sleep, the eating, the exercise, but doing things that bring you joy. Whatever that happens to be, as long as it's legal and doesn't interfere with your medication. But those are the kinds of things. If your family brings you joy, then spend time with them. If walking brings you joy, then do that. And sometimes it's hard to find the joy, really. But if there's something that makes you feel even incrementally better, then do that. And keep doing it until it has an effect.
Well, I thank you both for coming today and discussing it. And Molly, thank you for sharing.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And I hope to see you guys again.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Susan.
Parents should pay attention to their child's mood, especially when there is a noticeable change in their attitude over an extended period of time. Children and teens should understand that depression is not a weakness or a flaw. It is treatable with the help of others. Till next time, see you on You're Not Alone, Surviving Your Child's Disability.